Right, so my name is Mark Moore. I'm pretty new and young here. Somehow I got roped into being part of the committee. I think just to bring the average age down a little bit. So hopefully I bring in some new ideas and some things. But I had this old lathe that my grandfather had that I don't think he ever really used, and I have had it sitting on a shelf collecting dust like a lot of tools. And recently I said, okay, let's pull this out and let's learn a few things. And so I went over to Ken's a few times, and I found him to be an excellent teacher. He has taught me a lot in just, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours together. And so I brought in my lathe, and we're going to show you some things, but I won't talk anymore. I'll let Ken do most of the talking, and I'll be his ugly Vanna White, and we'll do this. So.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Why does everybody count during that? I don't know.
Yeah, you're good.
Anyway, I'm Ken Sherwin. I got my first lathe. It was a shop smith. Paid $50 for it about 5 years ago, and discovered that is a slippery slope. Like many other things that we play with, the first step is the cheapest one. Okay, let's talk about the things that I brought in first. If you can't see, come on up here closer. Then eventually we're going to get over here and make some shavings. First, I'm going to tell you some things that you already know. You learned them so long ago that you don't even recognize that you know them. Anybody recognize a pocket knife? Of course, we all have pocket knives. And things that you learned when you got your first pocket knife was you don't try to make everything in one cut. If you want to put a point on it, you don't carve that whole point at once. You make a lot of little cuts. And this is all going to make sense later. Green wood is easier to cut than dry wood, but it doesn't sand as well. Plugs up your sandpaper. Cutting downhill to the grain, like I did on this point, works a lot better than cutting uphill on the grain. It tears out, it shreds, it's hard to work. It doesn't take long to figure out the easy way to carve. And sliding the blade, like that, works better than just chopping it. So, things that you learn from a pocket knife are kind of important. That's the first time that we put an edge on a stick of wood. Another thing that we learned is if it's a little bit rough, you can turn the blade up vertical and you can scrape. You can get a very smooth finish by scraping. Show of hands, is that news to anybody? No, we learned that when we were 8. About a chisel, not real tough to use, but everything you learned with a pocket knife still applies. It's putting an edge on wood. But if you want to mortise in a hinge, for example, with a chisel, accurate measuring is very important. Accurate marking is important. Accurate cutting to that mark is important. And putting the bevel down, it makes it a lot easier to work than putting the bevel up most of the time. You can control the depth of cut with your chisel by moving the handle up and down. True? Is this news to anybody? Nope. And everything that you learned with a pocket knife still applies. If you try to cut uphill on the grain with a pocket knife or a chisel or a plane or any other edge, you get tear out. Dramatic like that, or if you're using a lathe and try to cut uphill, you get a rough cut. I've circled a place where I cut downhill and a place where I cut uphill. Let's pass that around so people can see the difference. Is this news to anybody yet? Nope, we all know it. Now let's move on to a real tool. That same door that we hung doesn't fit. We have to shave the edge of it off. So you drag out your little block plane. Or you drag out a decent plane. Which one of these is easier to use? The heavier one? Going faster is easier than going slow, because as the variation in the wood happens, the inertia of the plane helps you through that. Faster is better. Continuous cuts are easier than interrupted cuts. And the most important thing we learn about a plane, a hand plane, is that it's a lot of work. There are people who do use tools like this for enjoyment. I don't understand these people. They have fun, so that's all that counts. I'm an engineer, so I understand why they invented electricity. But everything that I've talked about here is about putting an edge to a piece of wood. When we come over here, we're going to put an edge to a piece of wood. Guess what? Everything that we talked about still applies. There's really no need to be afraid of a lathe, because it's just putting an edge to a piece of wood. If you've never ever used a lathe, you already know 90% of what you need to know. There's no need to be concerned about it. I talked about cutting uphill versus downhill. Let's talk a little bit about grain orientation. Probably you already know this. Typically, we consider the grain running the long way, and if you put it on the lathe like we have over there, that's called spindle orientation, because that's how they make spindles. Not necessarily a unique naming system. If, however, you grab it sideways and turn it this way, well, you can't make very much out of this, but if you start with a big piece, you can make something like this. If you look at the side of it, you see that the pith is here and here. So the tree grew this direction. We turned it sideways, they call this bowl orientation. That'd be a good thing to make bowls out of, wouldn't it? There's also burl, where the grain just goes every which way, and I don't have any of that. Being an engineer, I find having to depend on the grain of the tree being however it is to be less than adequate sometimes. So, segmented turning. I've brought in several segmented pieces that I've done over the last couple of years. The grain runs circular. The bowl was cut wet and dried out. That's why it's warped now, in case you're wondering how I managed to turn that weird shape. Not really news yet, is it? Well, let's start talking about something new. I've got about 16 knives of various shapes up here, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. Should I buy a set? Here's a group of craftsmen, 8 knives, and you can buy the whole set for maybe $100. The problem is they're not very good knives. Handle this one and then handle this one and see if you can feel the difference in them. It's kind of like the difference between these. I would much rather use one good tool than have a dozen really cheap ones. So I'm not a big fan of the kits. The other problem with a kit is, has anybody bought a set of router bits? 66 router bits. How many of them do you use? Maybe 3. The rest of them just sit there. So I would strongly suggest, if you're interested in doing this, is get one good knife. This is a 5/8 bowl gouge. It's fairly heavy. You can do a lot of things with just a bowl gouge. Bowl gouges will cut with the grain and across the grain. It will cut in, it will cut out. You can do a lot of things with just one tool. Learn how to use it, and then when there's something that you need to do, you can justify something else, maybe a parting tool. But get your tools as you see that you really need them. Eventually, maybe you need a hollowing tool if you want to do something inside a vase or something like that. But one interesting thing you can do is a bowl gouge won't make sharp corners. There's nothing pointy on it. Well, if you want to get down in and make a nice deep groove, find an old screwdriver and make your own. It's not difficult. Like they say, this is not rocket surgery. Let's talk a moment about carbide. Here are a couple of carbide tools, and if you look at how carbide works, they're generally always scraping. So if you take a lot of wood out with a scraper, it's going to tear. And that means a lot of sanding. Anybody like sanding? Well, eventually we're going to talk about a way that makes sanding a lot easier, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not a big fan of carbide, even though I have some. If we're going to do something on a lathe, we've got basically 4 questions we have to ask ourselves. Think there's any reason to pass the knives around? I think you can come up and look at them later. Decisions to make. What do I want to make? Kind of a fundamental decision before you walk out in the shop, isn't it? What materials do I have? Or what can I talk the wife into letting me get? What tools do I have? Or what can I rationalize? I want to make a vase. Oh dear, I don't have a hollowing tool. Hey Jan, I need a hollowing tool. Well, okay, if you really have to. And then, how and where do I hold the piece? I want to make a vase. How am I going to hang on to the wood? That's a really important thing to think about before you get started, because if you can't hold it, you can't turn it. That's not really news, but if walking out to the lathe is not a good time to try to figure out how you're going to hold the piece. That needs to be thought about before you get started. Speaking of holding work, that's the next topic. Most lathes come with a faceplate, like this one. Threads onto the arbor, or onto the spindle. A few screws lets you put whatever you need out here. Most of them come with a spur drive. And it's a point with either 2 or 4 edges that drive into the wood, and now that will let you spin the work. Glue blocks. I'm just going to go down these in the order that I thought of them. This particular glue block is grabbed in a chuck that we'll talk about in a moment. You glue your part to the surface. Turn your piece and then cut it off somehow. Perhaps use the parting tool. Perhaps use your gouge and carve away all of the glue block. This came from your scrap bin. So when you get done with it, it can go back to your scrap bin. A really interesting drive that we're going to use here in a few minutes. Today they are selling as a safety drive. Looks like this. There's a point to hold your work centered and a ring that you drive with. But it's a smooth ring. That means that you can't get very much torque. What that means if your lathe is running and you accidentally get a catch, it doesn't do anything. So you don't have to be afraid of, is this going to fly out? Is it going to do something dangerous? If I'm learning how to do things and I move the tool just wrong, is this going to be dangerous? Well, that was not dramatic at all, was it? They call it a safety center. The funny thing is, that lathe, well, my lathe from 1953 came with one of those centers. They called it a dead center back then. You put it in the tailstock, and the ring keeps the wood from splitting out when you crank the tailstock in real hard. Somebody has discovered that that's a good way to drive it if you want to drive your wood very lightly. We're going to see why that's important here in a little while and how we might use that drive practically. A lot of people use scroll chucks, and I have 2 of them here. This one I have a fairly large set of jaws in it. There's a set of small jaws that go in the same chuck. This also has a woodworm screw. You drill a small hole in your work, fasten this in your chuck, and now you thread your work onto this drive. It holds it square against the jaws and pulls it up tight with the thread. And that's a very strong joint. You can have a cup drive. Eventually, we're going to turn some spheres. Well, how do you hold that? With a cup drive. And then you have another cup on your live center at the other end and you squeeze it this way. How about a drill chuck? Everybody's got a drill press. If you're lucky, your drill press chuck will also fit in your lathe. If you're not lucky, like Mark wasn't, you got to go buy one. You can put a drill bit in it. Well, that doesn't look very much like a work holding device, and that's what we're talking about. You can turn a pen. Start off with a stick, something like that. Use the drill bit, drill a hole down in it. Now hold it with your tailstock, turn it till you get a thing like this, and now you can turn this to get it shaped, get it smooth, get it finished. When you're all done, take the drill bit out, you can slide your insert in it, and you have a pen. 50 cents. But a drill chuck and a drill bit makes a good work holding device for some things. What about the other end, the tailstock end? Well, you can have a live center like this, or you can have dead centers. I can't imagine any reason for using a dead center. That's something without a bearing. Whatever you have just slips on the wood. So I would not use a dead center in the tailstock for anything these days. Live centers are too inexpensive. The one that's in that lathe right now was 15 bucks. This one lets you replace the tip. You could put in a cup center. You could put in a point. You could put in an adapter, and now any tool that fit my Shopsmith lathe will now fit the tailstock. By the way, I can put this in the headstock as well, and any tool that fit my Shopsmith now fits my Nova. What if I want to turn something like that, and I want to touch it with something softer than these metal parts? You can make a wood insert to go in here. If you can turn a taper, you can make an insert. There's one in case I need it one of these days. Goes in there, and now it's up to my imagination what can go in here. Those are easy to make. Start off with a piece that does fit. This is a number 2 taper. Glue a block to another block. Can you do that, Mark?
Yes.
Okay. Got to check once in a while. Lay your part up against it, and glue another block up tight against it. It's not tough yet, is it? Now you have a gauge that you can start turning a piece until it fits. This live center lets you turn things that have a big hole in them already, such as a vase. You've finished the inside of it, now you need to hold the outside to do something to. You can do that. But this also unscrews. There we go. Can you drill and tap a 3/4 10 thread in a piece of wood? Sure. Then whatever your imagination will allow, you can thread on here and have a live center where the part that contacts your workpiece is up to your imagination. So there isn't any real limit to the kinds of things you can do. And you don't need all of that stuff. You can start with a single $15 point. You don't need to spend a lot of money. We reserve that for after you get started, and kind of like your first dose of cocaine is a really cheap one. I'm afraid that's kind of the way that is. My first lathe cost me $50. My wife decided that she wanted something from a lathe, and I bent the spindle in it because the spindle was too light. When I told her she couldn't have the base she wanted, she asked me when the new lathe was going to get here. When your wife insists that you buy a new lathe, that's not a bad thing. My second one cost me $2,500. Probably I won't need another one. I tease her occasionally that I need a new $8,000 robust lathe, but she's not buying it. Let's talk about sharpening. We learned back when we were 8 that a sharp blade works better than a dull blade. Sharpening is necessary. You have to keep it sharp, because if it's almost sharp, it'll almost cut. You have to be able to sharpen the same way every time before you can sharpen it the right way. If you sharpen it once and get it perfect, sharpen it the next time and something is off, and you're trying to figure out how to use all of this stuff, well, is it your technique? Is it the tool? Is it the wood? You really don't know. So you have to be able to do the same thing every time. That means either a lot of freehand practice and be able to see well, or you need a jig. And if you see my hand-sharpened drill bits, you understand why I bought a jig. There are a lot of jigs available these days. There's a lot of grinding wheels available these days. What I chose was this Wolverine jig from One Way. There are copies of it around now. This lets you control the part so you can put it on your grinding wheel the same way every time. This one, for example, went in here and just rolled it across like so on the grinding wheel. What about something with an angle to it? You can buy a piece that goes sideways on that stick that offsets the handle. You can put this out this way and grind one side. You can put it out this way and grind the other side. And you can do the same thing every time. Control the angle by moving it in and out from the wheel, and control the angle this way with how far apart you put these stops. I have not made friends with a skew yet, so even though I have a cheap one like this one, it's in the drawer waiting for some reason to have to get it out, or some reason to buy an expensive one. So when Mark wanted me to sharpen this the other day, I created that. One way to guarantee that you're doing the same thing every time. That's really what you're looking for first, is I take a Sharpie marker, color up the blade, and now put it on the jig, put it up against the wheel with it turned off, and then just spin the wheel manually. Oh dear, it hit clear down here, so I need to move it out a little bit. Now it hits right up there. Whoops, went too far. So you can move that in and out, you can move it sideways until you get the contact that you're looking for, and you can see it very easily. Once you get your jig set up, now you can sharpen it. You leave your jig set alone. Now you come over here, you work, it gets dull, come back over here, sharpen it, or just touch it, work some more, and you may go back and over to that sharpening system 5 or 6 times on one piece. Why would you have to go back? Well, because your edge gets dull. How do you know that the edge is getting dull? Well, how did you know your pocket knife was getting dull? It pushes harder. It's hard to control. You're trying to carve your stick, trying to slice a little piece out of it, and it just kicks out. It's just hard to control that blade. That means it's getting dull. You learned that a long time ago. Guess what? It's still true. If you look at what's coming off of your part, are you making sawdust or are you making shavings? Go back to the pocket knife. We made a shaving. It must be sharp. If you're making sawdust, it's not very sharp. And probably the most important thing is if you ask yourself, could this stand a little bit of sharpening? I wonder if this could use a little help. If you find yourself asking that, it's really needed sharpening for some time now. So if you sharpen it, I've been doing this for a little while, and I still surprise myself when I resharpen the tool. I ask myself, why didn't I do this 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes ago? There's just such a huge difference between a dull tool and a sharp tool. So keep it sharp. Just one quick swipe is all it takes to go from almost sharp to sharp. And if you just keep working that almost sharp tool and getting it duller and duller and duller, it'll take more work to bring it back. So you don't save anything by using a dull tool. But let's go back to the beginning. What can we do to start using a lathe? What can we make? Well, if you get a restaurant placemat and turn it over, and your first box of crayons, did you decide what sort of a portrait you wanted to make, or what sort of a landscape you wanted to draw? No. You scribbled, you learned how to use your tools. Well, we have to learn how to use the tools with a lathe also. So we look, it would be nice to have something that is cheap. How about an 8-foot 2x4? What are they, $3 now?
Something like that.
So you could get 16 pieces. Make yourself a bunch of pine 2x2s about a foot long. They're cheap. When you're done, it makes good kindling. You got some shavings that light easily. You got something that's easy to do something else with. It's only pine, so you're not going to feel bad when you ruin it. At least I did. I ruined it. We are going to practice tool control. We don't care about sanding. We don't care about finishing. This is only how to work a knife. Well, so the first thing we have to do if we're going to use this is decide how to hold it. So let's hold it on 2 centers. Let's use a safety center on one end and a live pointy center on the other end. Could you set that up on the lathe for us?
Good to go.
Done. Isn't that great? When you have a stick like this, the first thing we have to learn is how to turn it down and round. We can't make very much with a square piece, so we need to get it round first. So here's a stack of 16 pieces. So you put your first square one in, and you go through and you make it round. When you get it round, you take it out, put another square one in. You make it round. By the time you get through 16 of those, you probably understand how to make it round. Then, it's likely to be rather wobbly, like that might be. So make it the same diameter. Take all of those pieces out from under the lathe, put them back in. Now make it the same diameter consistently. Turn a cylinder. And by the time you get through 16 of them, maybe you can cut a fairly decent straight line. Then make a cylinder of a given diameter. This one is 2 1/4 inches. That one was 2 3/8. The next one was only 2 inches. Okay, make a whole bunch of them 1 3/4 inches. That gives you practice in controlling the depth of cut and controlling the angle. After we've done all of that, where we have some control over the part, now you can make some cove cuts. Start off with your tool, not that one, and cut downhill both ways, remember, until you have a bead. Rick?
You just picked up a different tool. Is there a big difference between a spindle gouge and a bowl gouge?
The question was, why did I pick up this tool and put it back down? Is there a difference between a tool intended for a spindle and a tool intended for a bowl? And let's talk about that a moment. What I picked up first was a homemade scraper. It's good for smoothing, kind of like a card scraper. There are people who can use a scraper and cut out big shavings, but generally they leave a rough surface if you take a lot of wood out. A scraper on a lathe, in my opinion, is take out very fine tool marks. That's why I put that thing back down. The difference between a bowl gouge and a spindle gouge is the angle, and a bowl gouge generally has these swept back wings. By the way, don't rub your fingers down the blade. It leaves an opportunity to use a Band-Aid. A bowl gouge is typically a lot deeper. It's heavier. Pick up this thing and then pick up this one, and you can feel the difference. Spindle gouges are typically lighter because you're always cutting with the grain. A bowl gouge is going to be cutting with the grain here, but when you get it over here, it's cutting cross grain, and when you get it over here, it's cutting against the grain. So there's a lot more challenge in the cut with bowl orientation. So the gouges are generally heavier. A bowl gouge will cut with a grain like a spindle gouge does, but a spindle gouge will not cut across the grain very well. That's why I suggest getting a bowl gouge first. That make sense? Okay, so let's start with this. We need to lay out a center. So you could have a plastic tool like this. You lay it in there. Draw 2 lines. That doesn't look like the center. That's this corner. Okay, let's make all 4 corners. Because whoever cut this 2x2 didn't cut it quite straight. Hard to get good help. Well, you put 4 lines on it, and now you can approximate the center of it. That was done on purpose, by the way. You could use your old stare center finder. You could use a ruler. Measure it, because remember we learned how to do accurate measuring and accurate marking a long time ago, clear at the other end of the table. Mark it and then poke it. By the time you get to your lathe, it would be nice to have a little hole, a little divot to start your center points in, rather than try to look down here and get the point lined up directly on your mark. It's easier with it here on the table. Get it lined up about where you want it, tonk it, and now you can, that's easy to hit on your lathe, because we're looking for easy. Do that on both ends. By the way, there may be some reasons that you would want to put your mark off center. You want to start turning it like this, then move it and turn it like this, so that you can turn on multiple axes. But to begin with, let's just turn it on centers, and we'll use our safety center so that we don't screw anything up. I'm going to finish this discussion before we actually go make shavings. Is that okay? Bill.
Yes.
Bill Kruger. There you are. He brought a bucket full of these things in last spring and suggested take a few, take them home, make something out of them, and bring them back next fall and see what can be made out of these things. Remember when he did that? Well, I took a couple and some of what I made are over there. Decided that spheres might be a good thing to make. I tried making a little goblet, but it didn't really look all that pretty. I'm not much of an artist. So I decided that making a sphere might be an interesting way to practice tool control and make something that might be interesting. So I did that, figured out the process and made a few. They were sitting around and both my daughter and stepdaughter saw those and said, "Ooh, those would be really nice, put a few of them in a bowl sitting over on the side table. Those would be pretty decorations." Well, they just told me, whether they knew it or not, what their Christmas present is going to be this year. So, to make a sphere, I'm going to go through the steps that I took. And you have to remember, I'm not an artist. I'm an engineer. I attempted to make a goblet. Failed miserably. Got to be an artist to be able to do stuff like that. This is about 3 inches in diameter and about 3 inches long. Well, to hold it, we got to put it in centers, got to turn it, then cut the centers off, or the knobs off, etc. So I'm going to lose a lot of material. I don't want that. I want this to be as large as possible. So what I chose to do was glue a little extra thing on each end that I could hold it so I'm not making marks in my good part. How are you going to find center on that? Keep in mind that we're going to do several of these. Well, I'm an engineer. That means I'm lazy. I like to minimize work. So I cut a washer of about the right size. Line up the washer on the part. Let it hang over a little bit. Let it go under a little bit. It doesn't matter. You can eyeball the material very well. Hit it with a punch. Doink. Now you have a little center point. Cut up a bunch of squares out of scrap wood. Put a little glue on there. Take something pointy. Put it through the hole that you pre-drilled. Line that up. Hold that until your glue gets tacky. And now you've got something on the end of your stick to be able to hold it. Now comes the interesting part. First, turn it down around and to the same diameter all the way across. We know how to do that because we already practiced. Knowing the diameter, we know that the length ought to be the same value if it's going to eventually be round. That means in cross-section, that's square. How would you make a circle out of a square? Well, you cut some 45-degree angles on it. At what dimension? If you do the arithmetic, that every side of an octagon is 0.414 times the original diameter. So we could set a pair of calipers. Start this, measure that at 0.281. Okay, 0.281 times 0.414 is whatever the number turns out to be. So now we can set the caliper at that value. Mark, yeah, that's about center. Mark it, spin it on the lathe so that with a pencil to get a mark all the way around. Do the same thing on the ends. And now turn from this line to this line. Just cut a straight line down both ways. And we can cut straight lines. We already practiced. Now we have an octagon. So next thing to do is to turn it into a 16-sided polygon. That turns out to be very, very close to 2/10 of the diameter. So you set your calipers at 2/10 of 0.281 is whatever that number. Set that, mark it, and cut each of those. There we knock the corners off. Mark it and knock each of those corners off. It's really not worthwhile trying to knock the corners off of the 16-sided one. It's just too easy to take your gouge, turn it up on its side, and use the edge as a scraper, because we learned from a pocket knife that you can take very fine corners off with your pocket knife on edge as a scraper. So we'll use this as a scraper and just brush it across there to knock those last corners off. That gives us that part. Now it's reasonably round, except we got those nubs sticking out. Grab a hold of it any way you can. Saw the nubs off. And now grab it with a cup on one side and a cup in your live center on the other side, like so, and turn it to turn these nubs off. Probably it will not be round when you start. So when you see your part, especially if you put something white on your lathe, as this is turning, you'll see a shadow. Turn only the shadow away. Turn it down until you get to solid wood. Then quit. Turn your part a little bit, turn away the shadows. Turn it, turn away the shadows. And when there aren't any shadows left, you're finished. Now you can start sanding. Oh boy, we all love sanding. So you keep going with finer and finer grits. You spin it this way. Oh, nobody's going to sit in a chair and rub it. We've got a lathe to turn the part. So we'll grab it between centers, but we can only sand the center part. So you sand the center part, turn it 90 degrees, sand it, turn it 90 degrees until you have the whole thing sanded down to whatever grit you're working with. Move to the next grit until you get it sanded as smooth as you think you need. And then finally, finish it with whatever finish you want to use. This particular one is lacquer. It needs another couple of coats. If you wiggle the light around, you can see a little bit of orange peel. It could stand just a little bit of polishing. And that is how you make a sphere. Just like every other woodworking project, what all of these different tools and all of these different steps are is use the tool that's necessary and the technique that's necessary to take away about 80% of the wood that you don't want. You want it easy to take away 80% and hard to take away more than 100%. Then you switch tools and take away 80% of what's left. And 80% of what's left, and pretty soon, it's practically perfect.
How do you hold the ball in there? Suction it back up?
Yeah.
Do you make that?
This particular one is a faceplate with a chunk of ash that we just gouged out a hole in, and for the drive center, and a plug for my live center that we gouged out a cup for that. You can spend $150 from Carter to get a set of cup centers, or you can spend 10 minutes and some scrap wood and do it for nothing.
Thank you.
The question was, could you have different size cups for different size balls? And the answer is, of course you can. I think I've got 2 sizes that I have made right now. More questions? The question was, how fast do you run the lathe? Well, it depends on how big a diameter it is, how smooth it is. If you're starting off with square, if it's already round, etc. And what I've discovered is that running the lathe about as fast as you can run it without it shaking is a good thing. If you run it slow, you get a lot of shaking. You get a lot of chatter. It's easy to get the tool too deep, and taking a few very heavy cuts is a lot of work. Taking a lot of very fine cuts is easier. Just like a pocket knife, cutting it a lot of small shavings is easier than cutting a few big shavings. Typically, when I have a question, what should I do? Why isn't this working? I go back and ask myself, if I was doing this with a pocket knife, what would I do? Putting an edge to the wood is really all it's about. Yeah?
This is almost deja vu all over again. When I was a young lad of 7 or 8, I would watch my grandfather carve spoons, and wooden spoons, and the thing that amazed me is when he was done, there was no sanding. He had created this work of art, if you will, a utilitarian object that was fit to take right to the kitchen.
An edge can give you an extremely smooth surface. And the better you control your edge, the less sanding you'll have to do.